Right, hello everyone. Thank you very much for joining this webinar. Dan and I are very pleased to be spending this Wednesday evening talking about the digital SAT. Dan, would you mind muting yourself just for a moment? There's a little bit of feedback. Thanks.
Sure.
We're going to try and take everyone through what the latest updates are on the digital SAT. We're going to talk about a few different things associated with that and then give people an idea about what they should be doing to prepare, either if they've already been preparing for the current SAT or if they will be brand new to it with the first sitting of the digital SAT. So without further ado, I am going to share my screen. There we go, and hopefully everyone can see that. So Dan is our academic director. Dan has been in charge of organising all our new curriculum for the digital SAT. He's been instrumental in updating everyone with what's going on, what the latest knowledge is, and he's going to be excitedly telling everyone about what materials we've got. Now, today, what we're going to be doing after I've introduced UES. So UES was founded almost 10 years ago. We work with a great number of students, particularly in the UK each year, who are applying to America. We help with all the aspects, and we're focusing on the SAT and ACT testing bit today, but we work with a lot of schools as well. But today we're going to be talking a little bit about the backstory. So why is the test changing, and what other things have changed and why? Talk about the new SAT format and what the broad changes are, and then we're going to drill down into what the changes are to the verbal, the English section, changes to the math section, and the now new embedded calculator. We'll talk about the adaptive nature of the test, so the question weightings and the score brackets. We'll talk about accommodations and what that means for students who need extra time on the digital SAT, give advice about how students should be preparing in order to be successful on this test. We'll update everyone on what our new materials and courses are for the digital SAT. I'll answer the age-old question, should you be doing the SAT at all, or should you be doing the ACT instead? And as usual, we'll make some predictions about the future of testing. Okay, so a little bit of a backstory. There's a very long history to standardized testing, dating right back to the 50s or 60s, which we won't go into, but if you ever go to one of our conferences, you can watch Dan talk about that. But the ACT went digital in about 2018. This was a major change, something that wasn't unexpected, but it promised that students would no longer have to do the test on paper and could go to a test centre and do it on computer. And that's currently the situation for most test takers outside of the US on the ACT. The SAT didn't choose to do that straight away, but they did roll out digital APs, the advanced placement tests that a lot of Americans take. And because of the pandemic, they rolled them out pretty quickly in 2020, and they were at-home tests, but it did give them a lot of experience in digital testing. They then decided that now is the right time to roll out the digital SAT. They have decided to do it just like the ACT internationally first, and then in 2024, it will be done in the US. The reason for that is that there are many, many times more students taking the test in America than there are in the rest of the world. So they're kind of trying it out on international students, but they have been doing a lot of work to make sure that everyone knows how it's going to look. Of course, SAT and ACT are rival companies. So the College Board want to do it better than the ACT. Let's see if they have managed that. The bigger backdrop is the test optional movement. Lots of colleges no longer require the tests. That is changing. Just today, we saw that Purdue and Indiana will require the test again next year. There are others that also require it, but there are also plenty of other colleges and states that have gone test optional or test blind. The pandemic has made that speed on a bit. But in terms of the College Board, they of course want to keep their test relevant. How do they do that? They try and make it align closely with what colleges want of students who are applying, and they try and make the experience nicer for students so that they're more inclined to take the test. And let's again see if they have managed to do that. The College Board has gradually released information about the new test, and they released plenty of practice tests. So we've now got a good idea of what they look like. And on the 19th of November, they did a digital trial internationally, and a few schools in the UK took part in that trial. We haven't got a huge amount of feedback from that yet, but it means that the College Board is trialing the test and making sure that it runs as smooth as possible. The current, just to update everyone, or rather inform everyone, to give you an idea of what's changed. On the current SAT, there are 4 sections. Now, there are 2 English sections, which we call reading and then writing and language. And then there is 2 math sections, a no calculator section and a calculator section. In the end, you end up with 2 scores. You get an EBRW score, which is an English score out of 800, and a math score out of 800, and then they add them together to give you a score out of 1600. The test is about 3 hours and 15 minutes long, but it's linear. Now, you probably haven't heard the term linear before, but that is used in contrast to adaptive, which is what the new SAT is, and we'll explain what that means in a moment. But a linear test is basically everyone does the same questions, it's 1 point per question, and then they scale the points to give you the score out of 800. It's on paper, multiple choice. The last sitting of that is this Saturday internationally. It's on the 3rd of December. Now, in America, they'll still be doing the linear paper test for the next year, but for international students, Saturday is the last sitting. Now, I'm going to hand over to Dan, who is going to talk about the new SAT format.
Okay, welcome everyone. So the new SAT is the current one's 50%, roughly 50% longer than the new one. So the new one's significantly shorter. As you can see in front of you, the verbal section is done in 64 minutes. By comparison, on the current SAT, just the reading alone is 65 minutes. So your reading comprehension skills and grammar skills and standard kind of English writing convention skills are condensed into 64 minutes as opposed to 65 minutes and 35 minutes, so significantly shorter. The math is shorter as well. The math is currently 58 questions. Now we're looking at 44 questions done in 70 minutes, and you're given significantly more time per question. As Jason said earlier, this test is adaptive by module. So the first verbal module determines the second verbal module that you receive. What we've discovered, actually what, I don't want to take credit for it, what one of our partner companies has discovered through tons of experimentation is that about 2/3 of questions correct on the first verbal module gains you access to the harder verbal module. Same with the math. And as far as boundaries go, what that means is if you gain access to the harder verbal module, then the lowest score you would receive is roughly 550 on the verbal. Same with the math. If you don't gain access to the harder module and you get the easier module second, unfortunately, you cap out at about a 650 on the verbal and the math. So it's really crucial for students to kind of come out strong on that first section. As always, the verbal and the math combined are scaled out of 1600. The SAT has or College Board has made a very strong point that your score on this test will be commensurate with your score on the current SAT. So what a 1500 looks like on the current SAT is supposed to be equivalent to a 1500 on the new SAT. As Jason just clicked, you can see that this is, again, a shorter test, an hour shorter. And it's all digital. In fact, College Board has come out with, as long as you have a College Board account, you can download the Blue Book app, and it's actually a really nice app, very seamless, easy to use. And in that app, you have access to 4 of these digital tests. And yeah, the first official sitting, as Jason showed, is in March 2023. All right, so let's actually talk a little bit more about specifics. So I'll be honest with you guys as an audience. The first time I took the verbal section of this new test, although it was shorter, I was absolutely exhausted. Significant cognitive overload. And I felt like, even though I don't have TikTok, I felt like I was doing the TikTok version of a test. On the current test, when you're given a reading passage, you're given about 7-8 paragraphs and 10 questions. So it's easy to get into a rhythm and a flow within that passage and then to be prepared for the 10 questions. On this new test, essentially, each question has its own paragraph. So every question is a brand new piece of content. At first, I thought, wow, this is exhausting. What I've actually come to realize, having kind of practiced and started to recognize the question types and realize what skills and areas of my brain are needed for each one, is this is actually a really coachable test. And as long as you're able to diagnose question type and you feel comfortable with what you're looking at and how to proceed, then it actually does feel like a much shorter test. As that first bullet point says, I'm in the process, almost done, of creating 15 verbal packets that break down every single problem type on this new test, verbal packets with instructional videos. And there are 7 question types that are entirely brand new. I could list them all off. I don't want to bore you guys, but just give you a couple. There's hypothesis support questions, which determine, essentially, you need to have a close reading there in order to determine what best supports a hypothesis. There's also questions that say what best completes the text. And those are inference questions where you really do need a deep reading. You need to understand kind of the flow of ideas from sentence to sentence in order to make an inference about where the ideas lead. Conversely, though, there are questions that don't require that much deep reading. In fact, it actually behooves you just to pay close attention to what the question wants. An example of that would be bullet point questions. On the bullet point questions, it may say something like, which of the following best shows the aim of the experiment? And in that case, the only answer that's going to be the correct answer is what gives the initial aim of the experiment. Any answers that give procedures or results, are no good. So you really don't even have to read that deeply into the passage. But anyway, what I found out is that familiarity with the question types, being able to diagnose them and understand kind of which aspects of your mind to employ, just helps streamline the process of test taking, avoids cognitive overload, and just allows you to kind of take the questions with confidence and clarity, knowing exactly what you need to do in order to work as kind of efficiently and purposefully as possible. The other thing, and I'll say this quickly, is vocab is back. So the pre-2016 SAT had fill-in-the-blank vocabulary. The accusations against that current test was a lot of the vocabulary was kind of esoteric. It was specific. The current vocabulary is more tier 2 vocabulary. In fact, College Board essentially has an algorithm that looks at introductory level university or college textbooks and pulls the most commonly used kind of educational tier 2 words. So by tier 2, I mean words that like construct or identify, words that aren't necessarily used in common language all the time, but also not specific to specific content areas. So tier 3 would be like cellular respiration. So anyway, this vocab is very much based in kind of college readiness skills and the ability of a student to be prepared to learn. So this vocab is a lot more purposeful. And I've talked about bullet point versus complete the text. Okay, cool. So then the math. The cool thing about the math is actually it's still prioritizing and prizing the same concepts. It doesn't go into pre-calc or kind of higher level, high school level math. That's not the point of the math. The point of the math is it's heavy on linear equations, functions, kind of Algebra 2 stuff and word problems, and kind of the breakdown of what types of questions you'll see is the same as what it currently is. So linear equations and functions are the two most heavily tested concepts. They still are. The difference, though, on this one is that students have access to a graphing calculator. Yes, some students use a graphing calculator on the current test on one of the sections. For this test, on all of the problems, you have access to a calculator. In fact, the app gives you access to Desmos, which is so seamless and easy to use. It's interesting, working with students in the UK, those who only take math up to GCSE, they go into the test without a graphing calculator. The one that's recommended for GCSE is not a graphing calculator. Even the majority of students who are taking A-level and further maths don't have a graphing calculator. So just the fact that a graphing calculator is baked into this test. Did we lose our shared screen?
Sorry, I was going to show the graphing calculator.
Oh, you're going to show Desmos. Okay, absolutely. As Jason's pulling that up, essentially, there's just one more avenue, one more way for students to be able to arrive at the answer. One of the things we teach is kind of lateral thinking and problem solving, and the idea that on multiple choice testing, there's always multiple ways to get to the answer. Well, with the graphing calculator, there's one more way and a very visual way. For example, in the past, this could be on section 3, where you're given a linear equation in red and a quadratic in blue, and you're asked to determine where they cross. Maybe you're asked to determine in quadrant 1, the positive point where they cross. Well, in order to do that, you'd have to be able to solve a system of equations. You may need to use a quadratic formula. This one doesn't look like you would need to. It looks like you could probably factor it. But anyway, that's requiring some Algebra 2 skills that all students may not feel comfortable with. On this test, you can just graph the two equations and find exactly the point at which they intersect. And then, yeah, Jason, anything you want to kind of add?
Yeah, I just want to say it's an amazing feat of programming, this calculator. The speed at which it puts graphs up. Now, if anyone uses a graphing calculator, I still have my old TI-86, which I got in the 90s, and I love it. But you have to really fiddle to put the graphs in, press go, watch them draw, and then click other buttons to get the simultaneous equation or the solutions up. This is near instantaneous. So I can put any equation I want in here, no matter how complicated. I can put a cubic graph. Well, I should really put x cubed minus x squared, something like that. I've got that cubic graph in red there. I can zoom in really quickly and I can see exactly where it crosses instantly. The speed you can do that is pretty amazing. So if people become familiar with this calculator, it's fantastic. You can still use the calculator exactly as you would normally. You saw me playing around with it there. If I want to work out what is 4 divided by 6, it's going to tell me instantly what that is. I can get other functions up. I can use all the trig functions, inverse trig, statistical things. It's really amazing how many functions you've got on it. What you really need to do as a student is familiarize yourself with it. Desmos, you go to desmos.com, you can play with it as much as you like, completely free, and just become really familiar with it, because this is exactly what it looks like on the Blue Book app. Great thing.
It's interesting, because originally I would say the process of gaining confidence on the math and being in the best position to score your highest score on the current test, the test that ends this Saturday, I would say it would be familiarity with the problem types and repetition with the problem types to be able to kind of diagnose and move through with confidence. For this current test, that's still key. You still want to go through the worksheets and packets and develop familiarity with the problem types and what they look like on the test. But now there's another layer where you can gain even more confidence and kind of attack the problems from another angle, and that's with this calculator. The one other thing I'll say with the math, and it's the same with the grammar or the verbal, is the questions are weighted. And we found out that the questions are weighted just by running through the Blue Book app and getting different questions correct and then missing other ones. So a big thing that it seems like is on the math, if you kind of gain access to the harder module, the harder second module, it seems like there are 2 or 3 questions at the end that are even harder than you'd see on the current test. And I think those questions are there to kind of sort out scores in the range of maybe 750 to 800. Yeah, so we talked about this earlier. So I don't know how much there is to say, mentioned it earlier, but essentially the key is to do well on the first module. If you do well on the first module, you gain access to the more difficult second module, which gives you access to potentially scoring into the 700s. You'll see harder questions on the second module, but the good thing is that, again, the questions all slot into the same problem types. And it's just a matter of learning the problem types, kind of what's expected, and developing a methodology around solving those problem types. So as always, the key to the SAT is gaining confidence with the content and how it's manifested on the test, and just feeling comfortable diagnosing questions and navigating through that content. And that just comes with going through the packets. The packets lay everything out specifically, exactly as you need to know it on the test.
Dan, if you don't mind, I think I surprised you with an extra section there that I wrote earlier today, but I thought
Sure.
it would be a good idea just to explain to people why the College Board has gone with adaptive testing. Adaptive testing is nothing new. Other major tests like GRE and GMAT, they do adaptive testing too. It's long been known to be a way of honing down to an accurate score very quickly. And that's the point of it. So as Dan said, because the second section is different and more aligned to the student's level, it means that students are then doing questions that are centered around their level. That makes things more comfortable for the student because they're only going to see questions most of the time that are around their level. If a student is really weak at maths, what we find on the current SAT and on the ACT is that they just might not be able to do the last 20 questions. That's not a nice experience for students taking this test. SAT will be different now because those students will just not see those questions. Doesn't mean that they can't do well. It means that they're going to be able to focus more around practice at their level. The really good students will see the harder questions and they'll be able to get up to that higher level. And as Dan said, there will be actually a floor of the score that they could get, even if they really mess up the last section. It also means it's quicker because you need fewer questions to actually find out what level the student is at. And that's why the test sections are shorter, the overall test is shorter. There's also a security point here, which is because students end up with different questions, it means that they can't read, it's going to be very difficult for them to copy, very difficult for them to take questions out of the test and then leak them online, which has been a big problem with these tests in the past, because people just won't know whether those questions will really come up in another sitting. So it makes it much easier from both the test setter's perspective and the student's perspective. Right, I'm going to talk now about accommodations on the SAT, because that's always something that comes up. Without accommodations, the test is done on your own laptop, as Dan said. It's 2 hours, or 2 hours 15 rather, at a test centre, usually a school. So there is actually no difference to the current SAT in that you will go to a test centre that is a school, but you take your own laptop there and do it there. Now, if you get extra time, same as now, you would have 50% extra. So it would actually be about 3.5 hours if you've got that 50% extra time. That's the minimum amount of extra time you can have. There are the other accommodations available, like rest breaks and things as well. But the key thing is it's all done on the same day at the same test center. So just like now, if you're taking the SAT, if you require extra time, you still go to the test center. You just do it sometimes in a separate room over a longer period of time. Exactly the same with the new test. But here's the interesting thing. You can choose now whether to do it on paper or on computer if you get accommodations. But that must be specified in advance, normally by the school who submits all your evidence. Ideally, you would get an education psychology report that will outline your needs. So if you think you need to do it on paper, you've got to make sure that everyone is saying that you need to do that and that you've got evidence for that. Other accommodations like Braille, large print, answer sheet with no bubbles, all available as usual as well. Test centres for accommodations, there are lots in the UK. The major international schools do it. People always ask, oh, can I just do it in my own school? The answer is no, unless your school is a test centre or a special test centre. That's very unlikely unless you happen to go to a school that is a test centre. But don't worry, there are plenty around the country. I think there's a little bit of hesitation at the moment about whether schools want to be a test centre for the new SAT because they're unsure about it. I think that will probably change, and we'll see a lot of schools become SAT test centres because, unlike the ACT, they don't need to have their own computers in there, and students will bring their own ones. There are, of course, wider issues, particularly in other countries and even parts of the UK, about access to technology like that, but there is a laptop sharing scheme or loan scheme through the College Board, so they have tried to think about those sorts of things as well. Okay, I want to talk a bit about how you prepare. Dan will probably chip in here, but the same messages apply to any test that you're taking. Regardless of the test or the format, start early. Please do not do this at the last minute. Please know which test you're taking and prepare over a long period of time, normally 3 to 4 months. It's very, very difficult and unusual for a student to do that much quicker. That doesn't mean that you have to be dedicating 8 hours a day for 3 to 4 months. I mean, you'd be very good at the test, but you've got better things to do with your time. What it means is regularity. If you did it every day for 20 minutes, I'm sure Dan will agree with me, you would be really good at this test after 3 months. It is not possible to cram for the test, and that's because it's not a test of how much you know. There are things you need to learn, like the content and the technique, but really it's about muscle memory, getting really familiar with this test and just spotting immediately what the question is asking you. So don't think that you can do it like you can for other content-based exams like GCSEs and A-levels. You've really got to become familiar with the test, and just it's got to be something that's fluent and easy for you. So you've got to know the question types, you've got to become fluent with the technique. There are plenty of mock tests already. There will be more in the future. And we're about to tell you about all of our offerings and materials that we have as well for it. So Dan has spent a lot of his time filming himself, talking about SAT problems. So on the verbal side and on the math side, we've got all the ones for all the question types on the current SAT. And Dan, I believe that you are creating videos for the new SAT as well. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And same for worksheets. We have loads of worksheets for all the different problem types on the SAT and the ACT. And as Dan mentioned, there are several new topics on the verbal side of the new SAT. So we're creating worksheets for all of those that would take students through all the different sorts of questions that they might see. If you can do those and you're familiar with them, then things become very straightforward.
And sorry to interject, Jason. I just want to be clear that 95% of the skills that students have developed for the current SAT are transferable to this new SAT. So the 7 new verbal question types that I've spoken about, they're still requiring reading comprehension. They're still requiring analysis and inferences. they're still requiring specific tasks on some questions where it's just about identifying exactly what the question's asking for and making sure you achieve that objective. So the skills that students need to employ on this test haven't really changed. It's just a matter of understanding which skills to use on which of the new questions. And that's just a little bit of a process of learning that and transferring those skills to the new question types. But yeah, just wanted to clarify that.
Great. We have a course book that we use when students start with us. That will be updated for the new SAT as well. Although we'll be doing much more online now and just digital, because that's what the test is like. New SAT tests are in our score tracking software, so students will be able to check their scores as they go on the new SAT. Obviously, it's changed now with the adaptive nature of the test, but nevertheless, we want to see how many questions the students getting right in the new format of the test. This is not ours, just to be clear, it's not one of our offerings, but the College Board has the Blue Book app that Dan mentioned before. Maybe if we've got a bit of time, I might demonstrate that, but you can go to bluebook.app.collegeboard.org, download their Blue Book app. That is the actual format of the test that you will be taking. Lots of practice tests in there, so it's worth trying that.
And just before you click to the next slide, Jason, just to be specific on bullet point 4, the tests that we'll have in our system are College Board's tests. They've created linear tests that are not adaptive. They've added a few more problems, but these tests are exactly the same problems as the current tests. So there are 4 current tests that are that way. And without the app, we're able to use those 4 tests and not only produce number of questions correct or incorrect, but also produce a score with the test. So those tests in our system will provide feedback and a score as well.
Brilliant. And very excitingly, we're offering a digital SAT conversion course on the 29th of January, which Dan will be running alongside someone else. You can do that in person in London or online. So this is particularly for students who have already been preparing for the current form of the SAT. So if you're a student doing one of our courses over the last term and you're taking the current SAT in December, and then you might be doing the digital SAT after that, this is the course for you. It's one day. It's going to give you all the knowledge that you need to know to go away and start preparing properly for the digital SAT. As Dan said, 95% of what you've learned will be applicable, but you need to know what the new format is like, what the technique is like, and what the timing is like, and those new bits in the verbal. So please do sign up for that conversion course. I'll give you the link to that in a moment. It wouldn't be a webinar without me talking about the ACT as well, though. And just to dispel the usual myths, I had a question about this today, in fact. There is no preference from the college side about SAT or ACT. If they want a score or they look at scores, you can submit either of them. So you still have to decide which test is right for you. Now, we think that many people will prefer the digital SAT. The reason we think that is because it is a more comfortable test to take now. But also, we've got the data on all of our students who've been doing our diagnostic tests and our courses and things over the last number of years. So we know what aspects of the test that students find difficult, struggle with, and take longest to learn. The digital SAT makes those aspects much, much more easy. What we think and what we've programmed into our diagnostic test is that students who are good at STEM, so science and maths, and who are fast processors will probably find the ACT quite straightforward. So if you can do maths and science and you're confident of that, and you are a fast reader, you can probably nail the ACT pretty quickly. But the interesting thing, though, is that ACT students, so those sorts of students, will probably also be really comfortable with the digital SAT because, yes, there might be a few other things they need to learn, but they will get to grips with it very quickly, and they absolutely will not have a problem with the timing if they don't have a problem with the timing on the ACT. ACT is much faster. So as a result of that, we think the majority of students will be taking the digital SAT. So hopefully there will be no technical issues with it, and if not, students should be much happier with the environment of taking the digital SAT. SAT accommodations are probably easier to arrange than the ACT, and the reason for that is that there are frustratingly few test centres in the UK that can deal with accommodations for the ACT. Some students will take the ACT on paper in their own school if they get accommodations, but they have to get that agreed with their school. The school has to agree it with the ACT. It can take time, and even today I was trying to organise that again for another student. With the SAT, it's much simpler because you apply for the accommodations or the extra time. If you get it, you go to the test centre and you do it. So it's much simpler to organise that. It doesn't mean that you're guaranteed to get the extra time, but it's much easier to kind of know what the deal is with it. Those students, we would probably recommend that you take the SAT if you need accommodations. The only exception is if you already know that your school is set up for doing the ACT on paper in school for extra time students, then go for that, because suddenly the timing is not an issue. You have a nice, comfortable environment in your own school and you do it on paper. But otherwise, probably SAT. In any case, take our diagnostic test. If you're not sure, or even if you are sure, please take the test. It's now adapted for the new digital SAT, so it'll give you the prediction of which test you should do of ACT versus new SAT. There's the link, ueseducation.com/diagnostic. Please go and take that. So a few predictions. Always like to make predictions that don't come true every webinar. Although I think I'm going to be pretty spot on with these ones. Let's see what Dan thinks. I think the SAT will become more popular than the ACT. In the last few years, the SAT got kind of taken, it did actually get taken over by the ACT, in that the ACT was the more popular test worldwide. I think outside of the US, in the next year, the SAT will become much more popular. What do you think, Dan?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think the messaging from a lot of test companies is a bit hesitant towards the digital SAT. That said, the digital SAT is a much more coachable test, and it doesn't have the time restrictions and some of the trigonometry and pre-cal that the ACT has. So, sorry, I don't know if you guys can hear it. That's my 3-year-old running around. But anyway, I think as companies and people shed their hesitation towards the digital SAT just because it's new and feels a bit unfamiliar, I think eventually that will become the preferred test, just because it's such a coachable test.
Yeah, I agree. Longer term prediction is that the SAT will move away from test centres. What I mean by that is that I think the tests will inevitably become at-home tests in the end. They've already tried it with the AP, worked pretty well. GRE and GMAT are doing at-home tests, IELTS are doing at-home tests, and Duolingo is an at-home test. So the SAT and the ACT will move that way in the end, for sure. The reason for that is that you then no longer have to worry about test centres. The difficulty is, of course, test security, but there are really clever ways around that at the moment already. And it will make it so easy for students if they can just do it when they want at home. So that is my prediction longer term. College boards and the ACT, a couple of years ago, at the beginning of the pandemic, said that that's what they were going to do. And then they quietly stopped talking about it. But it is clearly the trend towards it. Here's one suspicion. The ACT is obviously going to be looking at a way to respond to this, especially if they think, like we do, that the SATs are going to become more popular. They're probably not that worried about the international market because it's relatively small compared to the US. But if in 12 months' time, when the SAT is about to go digital in America, the ACT haven't done anything to respond, there could be in a bit of trouble. So they may well try to leapfrog the SAT and bring out at-home testing. Who knows? We'll have to wait and see. Or they might just double down on paper testing and hope that people prefer that.
I'll say this. The ACT has been very constant with the topics that are tested uh, for the past 3 decades. They made one big shift in the early 90s, and they haven't shifted since. So yes, digital, perhaps at home. The ACT has stood pat on saying, "Hey, the content on our test aligns very nicely with school curriculum and college readiness skills." So I almost imagine that's their linchpin. So I maybe they'll shorten their test, but as far as any type of content shift, I just don't think that would happen on the ACT.
Okay. So, as always, I want to remind people it's not just about testing. Yes, we prepare people for the tests. We also advise students on the best ways to apply to international universities and what the most important things are in that. We spend a lot of time talking about testing because it's complex, it's nuanced now with test optional movement, but the truth is it really depends on what kind of student you are and where you're applying and how. So do think about the other things. Remember that US applications in particular are holistic, so they have no set rules about what you've got to do. Okay, they might have some rules in some places that you must submit a test, but they're not saying that you must be at a particular level or you must submit this or you must be this kind of person. They're looking at your whole application in total to understand what kind of a person you are. So that means that you've got to think about what you can do to highlight your best qualities, and that includes things inside and outside of school and how you can use your time wisely. Don't spend all your time doing testing if you've got other things that will be more impressive to a college. The way to mitigate against these things is to start early. That makes it more likely you can do more things, including testing. Do check our upcoming events. In March, we're going to have our annual mock admissions event. I'm not sure if it's on there yet, but that's a great event, often attended by a couple of hundred people, that allows you to play the part of an admissions officer and work out what colleges actually look for when they admit students. So it's a good thing to come along to. If you're a teacher, we've also got teacher training things and regional fora going on in March. And we've always got loads of webinars going on there as well. Just to finish off, as I said, we offer advice and information on testing applications. We have a college counselling service. If you want to talk to me or to my colleague Simon, please book in a free call with us through that link, ueseducation.com/free-call. We'll be very happy to talk to you about applications. We also have week-long and weekly and schools courses for the digital SAT and the ACT. On that link there, ueseducation.com/courses, we also have stuff about the conversion course that's taking place on the 29th of January. We've got private tuition for both tests. There's that diagnostic test again. We also have partnerships with amazing people who do college counselling for lots of other different things, including America, and sports scholarship consultants if you are that kind of person. Those are our contact details. So I'm going to stop talking there. I'm going to leave that up for a moment, but I can see people are asking questions already. If you have questions, please pop them in the Q&A box, not in the chat box, and we will go through them and see if we can answer all your questions. So first question is, how far beyond the UK GCSE syllabus are the maths and English elements of the SAT? Is it more A-level standard? Dan, do you want to answer that?
Sure. Let me talk about the math first. So there's much less content beyond GCSEs on the SAT than there is on the ACT. What that content is there's a little bit on absolute value. There is a little bit on radians and the unit circle, which isn't covered in GCSE or isn't covered in depth. And then there are also just some basic statistical terms like standard deviation, margin of error. The great thing, though, is that the SAT is more concerned that students have familiarity with these concepts and that they're able to work through these concepts in word problems in real world situations rather than needing to do these concepts at some incredibly high level that would be required in further math or A-level math. For example, students may need to look at two separate pieces of data and determine which one has a higher standard deviation, but they don't actually need to go through the steps of calculating standard deviation. They just need to be familiar enough that standard deviation is a measurement of how spread out the data is, so they can just determine which of the two charts has data points that are more spread out. Real quickly, as far as English goes, reading comprehension, I think, is reading comprehension at any level. And what I mean by that is I think students are always kind of building their grade level of reading comprehension. But as far as the grammar that's tested on the SAT, I find a lot of that is either taught at a young age in school and then never revisited, or just not explicitly taught. Working with a lot of students, I usually find that they see big gains on the grammar questions just by learning what independent clauses are, how to use a semicolon, how to use a dash, and just being given clear, concrete explanations on what those things are.
Great, thanks, Dan. I'm going to answer another question first here, which is, do you think that students applying for colleges that look for strong readers or programs that require lots of long, dense reading should take the ACT, since the SAT is more about reading short passages, or should students still just take the test they score most highly on? The simple answer is the latter. Take the test that you are going to do better on. If you are applying for a program that requires lots of reading, then there are other ways that you will demonstrate that to the college. So you'll demonstrate that through your supplemental essays, you'll demonstrate it through your extracurriculars, you'll demonstrate it through your teacher recommendations, and you'll demonstrate it through your academics. The SAT and ACT is not really the way to prove your advanced reading level. It does show that you are ready for college at a basic level for all programs, but to really demonstrate your fit for a college that really loves reading and writing, you need to have much more than that. Someone else has said here, if I'm doing the current version of the SAT on 3rd of December, which is this Saturday, will I need a new whole course for the digital version or just a one-day conversion course? It depends. If you have already done private tuition or you've done a course, just the conversion course. If you haven't done any of that, you've just been practicing on your own, then you might consider a whole course, because there might be things that you just don't know that someone will be able to teach you. Of course, if you've been practicing well on your own and you score pretty well in December, you probably don't need to have a whole course or lots of private tuition. So maybe the conversion course. Either way, the conversion course will be helpful for you. But if you feel like you need lots more help to get up to a good level, then do a whole course. We've got a December course coming up, which is 4 days and 5 hours a day. That's one of our intensive courses. And we've got another one in the February holidays as well, in the half term. And we've also got a weekly course that starts in February, goes through to the March test. Dismiss those questions. Right, this is an interesting one. I think Dan and I will probably both have some input here. This person said that they took an SAT practice exam yesterday, got 17 questions incorrect in the math section, and got 480 points. Then they took another SAT practice test today, got 16 questions incorrect in the math section, and got 600 points. How is that possible if there's only one question different? Before Dan, I know Dan's going to have a lot to say on this, but before we do that, it would be interesting to know whether you took the paper test or whether you took the new digital test.
Yeah.
Either way, just to speak broadly about this, these tests are scaled scores. So it is not that if you get one more question right, you get an extra 20 points or whatever. It depends on the test. So you hear people talk about the curve. If the curve is broad, it means that you could, one or two questions either way is not going to make much difference to your score. But if it's a very narrow curve, a tight curve, you could drop off very significantly just getting one question different. Now, I suspect you've taken the digital SAT because that is a huge jump in score. So I'll let Dan explain why that happens.
Yeah. So for the current paper-based version of the SAT, roughly 17 questions. I say on the math, and again, as Jason said, they actually use equating where they have a predetermined curve for each test, and it's a slightly different curve for each test. But roughly about 10 to 15 points a question, a miss on the math. So 17 should come out to about a 600 on the current version of the SAT. If this is the digital SAT, one of the things that we picked up on is that the questions are weighted. The other thing is it may have something to do with where you're missing the questions. If you're missing the questions in the first module and you're being elected into the easier second module, that puts a ceiling on how high you can score. So there's just a lot more at play on the digital SAT. And to be frank, we're still learning a lot about how this test is scored and what the algorithm looks like, because it's an adaptive test with weighted questions. So my guess, Taylor, would be that you probably took the digital one based off of the fluctuation. But yeah, that does seem a bit extreme.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Yeah, my guess is that you probably got majority of your questions wrong in the first section, not the second section, and then that put you it could have put you in a slightly different bracket in the second section. The way to mitigate against that is to really work hard to get the first section at a good score, so that you always go into a higher bracket in the second section. Okay, this person has said this is more of a technical question. I'm not sure I can tell you exactly what to do here. I'll probably give you some advice. This person said, when registering for the SAT, they press the option, I don't know if I'll be able to bring my own device. And now you know that you will. How can you change that in your profile? The best thing to do is probably to, first of all, log into your account to see if you can change that on your registration. If not, it's probably best just to contact them. You will find a contact address, email address, or phone number on there. Call them, email them, and just say, I can bring a laptop now. Will that be okay? It's probably going to be fine, because you either will turn up and they will have a device for you, or you'll turn up and you'll be able to bring your own device anyway. And either way, it's probably going to be okay. You may need to download the Bluebook app on your device beforehand, so they link it, but that shouldn't be a problem. But I would suggest that you contact them, log into your account, check, contact them, see what they say, make sure you bring your device on the day anyway. We have no more questions, which is fortunate because we're just before 6:30. Oh, no, someone else has asked a question, just jumped in there. Someone said that they did take, so Talia said she did take the digital exam. If you get more questions correct in the first module, I'll have an easier time getting a higher grade. It's not really, that's not really the case. So with adaptive testing, what you shouldn't worry about is that you've got to get into that bracket or you're not going to score a high score. The point of the second module is to hone down around your score. So if you're on the cusp of two sections, you will either be in a section that's easier and therefore you'll get up towards the top end of it, or you'll be in a section that's harder and you might be near the bottom end of it, but those overlap. So you should still end up at around your sort of level. I suspect that what's happening at the moment is that there's just a lot of stuff that you don't know. And the more that you learn about the test, the more that you practice on it, the closer you will get towards your real score. Because the same in any test, the first few times you're practicing the test, you just fluctuate all over the place. Because they're just, occasionally there are questions that come up that you don't know. Sometimes there's questions that come up that you do know. So take the test more, but it sounds like if you're getting that number of questions wrong, you need to take a step back, first of all, practice through understanding the content and the technique, maybe consider a course. There are online courses and free resources for practicing the question types before you actually take mock tests. And then you'll find that when you do take a mock test, you'll be much more comfortable with it, and your score will end up being more consistent. So don't worry too much about whether or not you got into the harder second bracket or anything like that. It's probably more to do with your just natural score fluctuating around. Okay, good place to stop. So I just want to say thanks to everyone. I'm going to stop sharing there. Thanks to everyone for joining. We had a really good turnout today, very popular topic. And Dan, thank you very much for helping out today, and also for all your work on the SAT. Really excited to be rolling this out for all these excited new students from the on the digital SAT. If anyone has any questions, feel free to email us. There is that free call link that I had up before, and you can always just drop us an email if you've got any questions at all, and this recording will be up on our website shortly. Thanks everyone, and thanks Dan, and good night.
Good luck, everyone.